Fantastic. So like I said, I'm going to record this, and you know, I'll put it up on YouTube. And if you just go to our page, MCC Funeral Service, MCCC Funeral Service, anybody can watch it. If you know somebody that went to another school, they're welcome to watch it. I always send out a link to the other programs, whether it be Eastwick or AMI or Northampton or whatever. Even HIMSS, I'll send them one. You know, it's something that anybody that can benefit from this, we want to see people pass this thing at a high rate. And we normally, and I'm not saying don't study for, because I think it was a very, very hard test. So I took it 20 years ago, but I still thought it was a very, very hard test. But we maintain like I want to say like on average, like 95, 96% pass rate on it. Now, that being said, most semesters, somebody ends up failing it, and that's never a good thing. But if you prepare for it, you should be good to go. And go to the state's website and download the regulations, both statutes. Take a look over them. The statutes are shorter. Remember, the statutes go back to the state, you know, up to the state level and outside of the state board, whereas the regulations come directly from the state board. You know, so the statutes will be much shorter, but the regulations are much, much longer because they get much more in detail. You're not going to ask a state senator, oh, what should we do in funeral homes about, you know, requirements for a prep room. That's outside of their wheelhouse. So the statutes tend to be much shorter, whereas regulations much, much longer. And so this is where you find them. And again, you just type in State Board of Mortuary Science, New Jersey. It'll bring you right to their page, and it's all outlined right there. So other examples, this is more one to, you know, this is where other things come from. I wouldn't dive too much into these. This is more of just a reference page for where all of these things come from, but they do impact us in a way. Health and vital statistics. You know, yes, I was just dealing with an issue with the death certificate earlier today. Corporate names, medical examiners, the whole thing with that. But I would really, and this is good to go over, but I would really get into those statutes and regulations. I think they're the most important thing. And trust accounts and tax waivers and things like that. Now, as we get into this, one of the things that I always really point out with this is that hold on, I'm gonna get my little notes up. I minimize my notes on these because I don't want to just read these things off to you guys. I want you guys to go and look up these things. If you look them up, you'll have a better chance of remembering them. And I think the best place to look is really the source material. But then secondarily, I would look at laws, the notes from laws, rules, and regulations. And if anybody needs them, I can send them out to you again, not a problem. But that was the whole purpose of that class, was to prepare you for this exam. So like I said, when we get certain things, time frames, things like that, how long do you have to change the manager's name, things like that, I intentionally leave it off. And when I'm sitting there teaching a class, I've got all the answers in front of me so I can rattle them off. When I'm doing this, I'm like, I think it's 5 days, maybe 15. I always forget. And I, like I said, I sort of do that intentionally. So you guys will go and look them up. So, all right, so license versus certificate of registration. Remember, a license is for the individual, the certificate of registration is for the funeral home. Both are on a 2-year cycle. You have to re-up them every 2 years. The individual, the funeral director himself, it's in odd years, right? So 2021, 2023, 2025. Whereas the COR for the funeral home is on even years. And the way I always remember this, I probably said this in class, that every funeral home, every funeral director I've ever met is an oddball. And so oddball, odd years. Death certificate versus a burial permit. Burial permit versus a transit permit. And remember, and the term burial permit is almost becoming antiquated. It's more of a disposition permit these days. You know, I know that funeral home where I work, where they're pushing 50% cremation. And so, yeah, burial is sort of an antiquated term almost. But the idea that if you are going to ship somebody on you know, a common carrier, you need to make a transit permit. And all you need to do that is you click a button and it magically changes. You know, it goes from being a burial permit or a disposition permit, boom, you click a button. Yes, they're going on a common carrier, US Airways or whatever, Delta, whatever company you're using. So what is a license required for? Arranging and pre-arranging, selling merchandise, and signing forms, right? If you're going to sign a statement of funeral benefit services, you have to be a licensee to do that. Now, as an intern, you're expected to do arranging these 25 times, but it's supposed to be under the guidance of whoever your preceptor is, under the guidance of your preceptor. So even if they leave the room and introduce you as the intern and, you know, they're going to be handling everything, that's fine, but you can't sign those forms. It has to be signed by the funeral director himself. Even if, and in a perfect world, what would happen is they would introduce you, you would sit down, you would go through everything with them. When you've done, the funeral director would then come back in and review everything that you've done, talk to the family, make sure everything's fine, and then sign off on that statement of funeral goods and services. To sign a death certificate. And again, this is a no-brainer these days. VDRS, I mean, back in the day, if you had a paper death certificate, somebody could physically sign it, but now you have to be in EDRS, and to do that, you have to have a funeral director's license. To embalm, and again, as an intern, you're allowed to do this, but it's under that supervision. At the point of disposition. Now, this is where it's interesting. This is why I mentioned this. By next year, I'll probably have this out of the notes. This was relaxed during the pandemic, and they said, look, you know, things are crazy right now. Let's just let interns take, you know, body to the crematory. But they worded it in a way that you could even take a funeral to the cemetery and oversee the services. That's now transferred back. So even if you, in your personal experiences, if you have taken bodies to the crematory, you know, if you have taken a service to the cemetery, just because things were changed during that time, that's switched back now. So if you see a question about that, remember, you're not supposed to do that. That's something that, you know, you need to have a licensee there for that. Now, to supervise visitation, dress, casket, and removal, no. Some states do require a license for removal. Delaware is like that. New York is like that. But in New Jersey, no, you can supervise a visitation. I used to get stuck with that all the time when I was an intern, where you'd be like, yeah, I don't feel like working to 7 to 9. Why don't you work? I'm like, all right, fine, whatever. You know, that's fine. Even if there's a service there, that's fine. That's not the point of disposition. If you're just doing a visitation at a funeral home or at a church or wherever, and you're not going to the place of burial or cremation, then you do not need a licensee there. So license renewal period, I was just talking about, I think I got a little ahead of myself there. The idea that even for the funeral home, odd for the individual. Now, renewal expectations, review the continuing education. Remember, it's 10 credits that you need for every renewal period. And what about those 5 that are required that have to be in person, right? How many of those, you know, are about pre-need? How many of those are about laws, rules, and regulation? How many of those are about OSHA? This is all stuff, and it's all in the regulations, and it's all in the notes from laws, rules, and regs. Now, license lapse.
Did you say?
Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Did you say that 5 of them had to be in person?
Yeah, there's 5 that are required that have to be in person, then 5 that you can just do online or wherever.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Now, license lapse, we'll talk about that in a bit because they switched that in 2019. The renewal requires that if you let your license lapse, there's a time issue, it's 5 years, and we'll talk about that in a couple of slides because they switched that completely in 2019. And you guys might be the first class to actually see questions that have the revised version of this. I talked to my predecessor about this when they made all these changes, and he said normally it took 1.5 to 3 years for these to really work their way into the tests. And things got really bonkers during the pandemic, and you know, they were not updating as fast as they normally would. So continuing ed courses, programs must be approved by the board. You can't just go, whatever. It has to be approved ahead of time. I sort of looked into the idea that, like, when I first took the job at Mercer, it was like, wow, you don't need to worry about, you know, getting continuing ed because you're teaching everything, so it doesn't matter. It's not the case. That might be the case if they approve it, but I would need to request it ahead of time. Like, you can't just go, like, teach laws, rules, and regs. You don't need to take any of that stuff. No, that's not the case. It needs to be specifically approved. So new in 2019. pre-need providers must monitor attendance and ensure completion of the lessons. So it used to be you would sort of come and go out of these lessons. Now, especially if it's run by the association, if you walk out of the room, like if anybody's ever been to any of these at the convention, if you walk out, they zap your badge, and they put you on a timer. If you're gone for more than 10 minutes, you can't be there anymore. Like that's it. They're not. You can be there, but they're not going to get credit for it. The CEU instructor, whoever's running it, must maintain records for 5 years after the fact. So inactive license. This is something that went by the wayside again in 2019. It was part of what they call, this is not important, I'm just talking now. It was part of what they call the sundown laws, where, or sundown regulations rather, where after 7 years, they need to reevaluate regulations and go, well, okay, this is still valid today. In 2019, this came, the mortuary board's regulations came up. They looked at them and they dropped a whole bunch and changed a whole bunch of them. Now, inactive licenses was something that used to allow somebody, let's say that, for example, the place that I work, Tommy Weber, nicest guy on the planet, but he's in his 80s. And, you know, it's people come there, they love seeing Tom. He built the place, everybody knows him. But, you know, it wasn't uncommon back before 2019 for the rest of the family to go, let's just make Pop's license inactive, and he won't have to do CEUs anymore. And we don't let him meet with families alone. And, you know, but we can still put him in advertising and everything. Like, you know, say, Tom Weber, the guy, you know, I probably shouldn't be using him by name. You know, and you could still use their name in advertisements, but they weren't allowed to do anything on their own. They couldn't be the supervisor. They couldn't run a funeral on their own. They couldn't embalm. They couldn't make arrangements on their own. They couldn't do anything like that. But it was an idea that people knew this person, so it's running in advertisements. They could get away with this. So if you're either licensed or you're not. Used to be, if your license lapsed, you got out of the funeral business. Said, look, I'm tired of this. I'm going to do something else. I'm not going to worry about any of this CEUs or anything like that. They used to give you 5 years, like a 5-year thing. Where, all right, well, if it's less than 5 years, you can come back and you need to make up some continuing ed. I need to pay past fees. They sort of revamped that and said, now if it's less than 5 years, they only require the fees and the CEUs from the current and previous licensing period. So at most, it would be 20 CEUs. If you're at the tail end of a second, like let's say it's been 4 years. Let's say it's been 5 years. It would only be that. Normally, you'd have to do 25 CEUs to get back. Now it would only be 20 because it would be the current, which would be 2 years, and then the previous, which again would be 2 years. And you only have to do fees from those two. You don't have to do 2.5. So they just sort of lessened it a little bit. Also, during that time, let's say that, like, I used to be licensed in Pennsylvania, and I let that license lapse because I just wasn't using it. I didn't feel like going over and doing CEUs. Let's say that's reverse, and you're in New Jersey, and you're practicing in Pennsylvania, do the same thing. I'll let my Jersey one lapse. Well, they will recognize your Pennsylvania ones. So Pennsylvania requires 6 CEUs per licensing period. So let's say it had been 5 years, you would probably have at least 12. Maybe you'd have the full 20, and they would recognize them from out of state and go, okay, that's fine. You're good with the CEUs. Just pay the backup fees, the past 2 fees from this licensing period and the previous one, and you're good to go. Let me know if you have questions on that. That's a little bit convoluted, but a little bit sort of inside baseball, if you will.
So if your license lapses, so it's not considered inactive anymore?
No, it is inactive. An inactive license, the terminology inactive license was a little bit different in that you were still registering every licensing period, but you weren't allowed to do anything. And it was just the idea that they would keep your name in the ads. And, you know, like, again, going back to Tommy Weber, if he were to just wrap it up, like, we really don't let him do a lot to begin with, but they still would want to have his name in advertisements because when people come in, they expect to see Tom. You know, so that's sort of what the idea of an inactive, a quote unquote inactive license was. If your license becomes inactive because you just let it go, that's a different thing altogether. That makes sense?
Yeah, so what if you're inactive? Could you maintain your CEUs as well? So let's say you're not really doing funeral work. Could you still attend workshops being
Yeah.
inactive?
If you're not a practicing funeral director, but you still want to keep your license, absolutely. You can still do the CEUs and keep your license going. That's perfectly fine to do so. And so long as you want to pay, the association will have anybody come to it, and whoever offers CEUs. So yeah, you can absolutely do that if you're not practicing. Inactive, and again, it does get a little convoluted because inactive, the way that the definition was previously, meaning that somebody's elderly and they really can't handle it on their own, but you still want to have them as one thing versus somebody who just let the license lapse. You know,
So to have a license lapse means that you're not paying that $350
yeah,
every 2 years?
exactly. And you're not doing the CEUs.
Okay,
And even if you do one or the other, let's say you did pay for the license, but you didn't do the CEUs, they would catch up with you eventually, and you would have to pay for that. You know, you'd be fined for it. And then if you did the CEUs, but you didn't pay the renewal fee, your license would be kaput anyway. You know? So more than 5 years. It used to be they had this whole mini internship thing, 3 months to a year, but they never really defined, like, they never gave us, you know, a way that we should be able to lay that out. You know, well, if you've been out this long, you do this versus this, or they never did any of that. They did away with all that, and they just said, all right, if you're out for more than 5 years, the New Jersey State Board would decide applicants on a case-by-case basis. So you put in your application, and let's say you've been out 5.5 years, and they go, all right, just take the JP exam, or, you know, take 3 months of an internship or whatever. But they didn't define any of that. It's just, we'll figure it out on a case-by-case basis. So if you're out for more than 5, it's just up to the state board what they want you to do. I wish I had more specifics on that, but this is the way that the reg was written, the regulation. All right, so what do you know about record keeping? How long do you need to keep records? And remember, there's a difference between New Jersey, and there's a difference between the FTC, and there's a difference between OSHA. Remember things like OSHA with medical records, all that stuff is fair game. Like, you're going to see predominantly New Jersey stuff, but the OSHA stuff is good to review. You know, medical records, duration of employment plus 30 years. Any training that OSHA training that you do, they have to keep for 3 years. With any funeral documents, you have to keep them for 7 years, right? So anything in a case file. So let's say what's in a case file. Things like the name of the clergy person, right? If it was paid for by the funeral home, well, you got to keep that for 7 years. And remember, the first year needs to be accessible immediately. So the inspector shows up, they go, I want to see this case from 3 months ago. You need to give it to them right away. If it's more than a year old, you have up to 2 weeks to get it to them. And the idea being you may keep that off the premises. And remember, something like the GPL is you have to keep that for 3 years in New Jersey, but the FTC only requires you to keep it for 1 year. Just stuff to keep in mind. Yeah. Itemization, and the idea, and again, this becomes more of an FTC thing, and that's why I put the FTC form up there. The idea that everything has to be itemized. And a lot of funeral homes get lax about this. I know I've been lax about it. When I was running a funeral home, somebody wanted one of the package deals. I would just write the package price down and move on from there. We would then later write up a full bill with everything on there and then discount it down, but you're not supposed to. You're supposed to have every item. So somebody comes in and they're going to get the bronze package, which you save $600 by. Well, you're supposed to have your basic service fee, removal, dressing, casting, cosmetology, embalming, use of the hearse, use of the limo, everything else, and your total. And then you're supposed to discount that down. Yeah, it's easier to just go, whatever, the total, instead of being 7,200 or 6,500 or whatever the case may be. But you're supposed to itemize everything out and then work it down. Now, the exceptions to this, and again, this is an FTC thing, are direct cremation, direct burial, I guess I could say direct disposition. Forwarding of remains or receiving remains. That you can just have, let's say, your direct cremation charges $1,800. You're allowed to write direct cremation $1,800 and move on. You're allowed to just package that up as a single unit rather than spacing everything out. Prep room expectations, and there's a whole thing in the regs about this. What are you supposed to have? You know, and this goes into things like, you know, the walls have to go all the way to the ceiling. You can't have like just a curtain that you put up and here's our prep room in this corner. It has to be a room solely used for that purpose. And I usually use the example of you can't just have a prep room that we embalm here, but when we're reviewing, we make it the ladies' restroom. Like we move the table out, it's fine. Like no, you can't do that. The instruments that you need. And there's a whole list in there, and it's things that you should, they're all the common instruments you need, though, like at least one aneurysm hook, at least one drain tube, at least one trocar, at least one cannula. It lays them out, and that's pretty specific, but I think it's pretty obvious, but it's not a bad idea to look it over and review it before you take the exam. I think this is more common. I'm not saying don't study it, but I think this is more common my time when I took the test versus today, just because I'm not saying embalming is not common. It is very common, but it's just not like an 80% rate as it was 20 years ago. Prohibitions, things you're not allowed to have in a prep room. And this can get tricky. Think about things like a stretcher. You're not supposed to have a stretcher in the prep room. You're allowed to bring a stretcher in to move a decedent off onto the table, but you can't store a stretcher in there. And the idea being that what if, you know, you've got somebody with hepatitis C and blood gets splashed on the stretcher, middle of prep, you get a house call, you run out, now you have that hepatitis C blood on the stretcher covering, and somebody's leaning on it and saying goodbye to their father. Now, could they pick up that disease from it? One time I had the inspector show up, and we had, I don't know why we had done it, but it took like 15 or 20 of the chairs. You know how you have extra chairs you put out for a big service, and we put them all into the prep room. And he showed up, and I was chit-chatting with him and like, hey, it is buying time. Well, the intern ran into the prep room and ran all of these out the back door. They were all in the backyard when we finished up, but they're not supposed to be in there for that same reason. Again, stuff I should not be admitting to on the internet. So FTC telephone price disclosures. New for 2019, the manager may designate employee, even if unlicensed, to provide price information on the phone. Anybody, this being said, anybody can provide price information on the phone. My wife is not licensed, but she works in the funeral home, and she often is asked, what's your price for direct cremation? And she can pick up a general price list and read off on there. You know, our cost is, I forget what it is, $26.75 or something like that. You know, she's allowed to just read that. Now, the manager can designate her as the person whenever a price shopper comes in, hand them off to her, hand them off to Jen, and she'll talk to them and do whatever. But again, I don't know why they wrote this legislation, but anybody can do it, but you're allowed to designate one individual person to do this. Responding to questions concerning information not on the price list shall be referred to a licensee or an intern, and that's the new thing on there. So let's say they are asking you something that is not specifically outlined. You're not directly just reading it off. Normally, the legislation said, the regulation, I should say, said you're allowed to say, well, I'll have a funeral director call you back. It now reads, you can have a funeral director or an intern call back. So an intern could call back and give more involved price information over the phone.
Professor,
Yes.
doesn't it say that on the regulations that you're only allowed to talk about pricing if you're in an arrangement, if you're an intern?
No, you can talk about pricing in any capacity. And this goes back to the FTC and the idea that if somebody shows up at your funeral home and they ask you for a general price list, you have to give it to them. And if they call and they just want you to read off like, okay, how much is it for direct cremation? You're allowed to just give them that. They don't have to give you any information. You know, who am I, what's my callback number, things like that. you basically have to give it back to them, or you give them that pricing. Now, one of the areas that creates confusion or a bit of a gray area or something like that is and this is by the FTC, not by the state, if somebody calls during off hours, like let's say they call you at 8 p.m. and say, I want to know the cost of the directory nation. You do not have to give them that price at that time if you normally do not do arrangements after hours, right? So if you have a policy on the books that says, I do not make arrangements after 5 p.m., you do not have to give them the price. It's stupid. Everybody would give the price because if you don't give a price, you're not going to get the call. But if you do make, and every funeral home does, you're going to have times that a family says, I can't come in until 6 or 7 p.m. You know, that's things that stuck here late. But no funeral. I cannot think of a single funeral home that does not do this work after hours. So that's where it gets a little murky. But yeah, no, you're absolutely allowed to give prices out outside of an arrangement. Now, you're not allowed to sit down and write up a statement of funeral goods and services outside of an arrangement. I'm sorry, go ahead. You have a follow up on that?
No, I was just saying, okay, because I thought I had saw something in there like that where it was saying that we couldn't, as an intern, give out price quotes without being in an arrangement.
Okay, you're coming on an interesting point here. Price quote meaning you sit down and write up a statement of funeral goods and services.
Okay.
It's a real fine line between the two. It's a really good question.
Okay.
Because if you go from sitting down and writing out a full quotation, writing out that statement of funeral goods and services being a formal quotation to somebody, whether that be a pre-need, at need, or if it is just a price quote, which you do have an option on the statement of funeral goods and services for that, versus somebody calling and just inquiring about prices.
Okay, that makes sense then.
Yeah, and they make it murky. They really do.
Mm-hmm.
It's and I don't think they mean to, but it's
Right.
It's a really
But that's one of those tricky things that'll mess you up on the test, though.
It is, yeah, it is. And they love asking those things, especially more so on the national board exam than on the state. I think the state test is a little more straightforward. Like I said, I do think New Jersey has a very stringent exam, but it's not nearly as bad as the national on that. So, all right, so multiple ownership disclosure. This is a New Jersey thing. A person who owns 50% or greater interest in this registered mortuary also owns 50% or greater interest in the following registered mortuaries in the state of New Jersey, along with the name of the funeral home and the municipality. Description enough to identify. This is the idea that you bought out your competitor and you own 2 funeral homes in the town. Family comes in and you say it's $7,500. They go, that's ridiculous. I'm not paying $1 more than $62.95. And they run out and then to the competitor, which is you. And you call ahead and you go, don't charge them more than $62.95, and that's what they charge them. Kind of a ridiculous thing, but it's you'll notice this. But Grace, go ahead.
So that means that, like, our funeral home, for instance, we own a whole bunch of funeral homes. They're all under different names, but we all own them. We would have to have that disclosure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
If they aren't on there, I'm not going to call the state board or anything like that, but you don't want your competitor to find out that you don't have it on there, And for a while, back when I owned, back when I still had my family, we had 3 funeral homes, and we rationalized it that, look, we're fine. It's I own 40, my brother owns 40%, my brother owns 40%, my mom owns 20. So none of us own more than 50% of this funeral home. Well, that doesn't work because what we owned was 50% of the corporation that fully owned the funeral home. So I've talked to other funeral directors that sort of have that mindset. And again, I thought the same damn thing, but no, it's you own that company. Your percentage ownership is in that company, and that company owns 100% of that business. So yeah, it's better to err on the side of caution. Most times the family's not going to come in and go, why owns that on there, or call the state board? But you don't want your competitor to find out and report you. So new to 2019, the multiple ownership disclosure only needs to be on the GPL, right? Doesn't have to be on your casket price list or your out of burial container price list if you have them. If it's all one document, yeah, it has to be there. But if they're separated, it's only on the one. The mortuary use issues. Used to be you could only collect a lock of hair for the family. In 2019, they switched this. You can collect DNA, and they said the longest time you were not allowed to do this via cheek swab, nail clippings, and/or blood collection. Now, what's not new is the funeral home may be the site of an examination to determine the cause and manner of death. Meaning you can have a private autopsy done at a funeral home, and you have been for years. I remember seeing one in like 2002 or 2003. You're allowed to do that, but you're allowed to do an autopsy, but you were not allowed to have, take DNA via cheek swab or nail clipping. They open it up as it's just more common these days. I mean, all these ideas, maybe we can clone people down the road. I mean, who knows? But they relax it a little bit. Food in the mortuary. This is overturned 2019, and this went up to the governor's office. And this is one of the very few things that I agree on with Governor Murphy. Not a big fan of that guy, but this one I agreed with. I don't smoke pot. I honestly don't. It's not my bag. But I agree that in decriminalizing marijuana, it's free. I had a buddy of mine from high school that got caught growing pot plants in like 1996, and he had to do like 9 months, maybe a year in prison. And this is the nicest guy on the planet. He was just a pothead, and I agree. But anyway, it's one of those deals that it makes sense. You are now allowed to serve or allow food and non-alcoholic beverages, but you're not allowed to prepare them for funeral home. So you can't have like a kitchen cooking it up in there and sending it out. But if people want to bring food, that's fine. If you close a funeral home, is that confusing? That's good, everyone. No, I don't. I think I've switched these so many times. I just changed the wording on it. So new as of 2019, you must show evidence to the state board that the EBRS account is closed, and you must inform the state board of a location and individual in charge of funeral home records. Meaning you screw things up, you go bankrupt, I'm closing this place out, whatever. You have to prove where the records have gone. And that new place needs to keep these records for 7 years. And just like the original funeral home, they have to have the first year's records available immediately, with the next 6 years records available within 2 weeks. So interns and intern regulations, preceptor qualifications. Remember, they have to be licensed for at least 2 years. How many interns might you have? 2 per funeral home. And remember, any given funeral home, and they only specify for the first intern, any given funeral home that takes an intern has to do at least 25 cases a year, not including stillborns. And the idea behind this is, if, let's say, you just get out of high school, you start working at a funeral home, and you do your first 2 years, your 60 credits, then you do the work at you do the funeral service education. That's 3 years of time. During that time, if you do every embalming, every funeral, every embalming and every funeral, by the end of it, it would be 75. It'd be 25 the first year, 25 the second year, 25 the third year. So that's where that regulation comes from. But you're allowed to have a second one so long as you have a second licensee. So the internship specifics, remember that the internship is by default 2 years. And remember the idea of a concurrent internship. Actually, I'll get to that in a second. Let me do this. Time, cases, background. Remember, by 2 years by default, if you have more than 90 credits, when you start funeral service education, they will drop that down to a 1 year instead of 2 years. You can push up to 3 years as an internship extension without question. You get your 1 year and 9 months into it, and you haven't done the tests, or you haven't finished the embalmings, or whatever the case may be, you send a letter off to the state board, they will automatically increase it by a year. It's not a problem. They'll give you a 3rd year without question. They will give you, if you get further along and you, like, I need 6 months because I failed the national or something, they will extend it a little bit in most cases, but that's not codified in any way. That's just on a case-by-case basis. If you fail the state board practical, you have to wait at least 30 days, pay the fees again, and then you can register for it a second time. Now, concurrent intern, remember that, and again, this is weird, especially you guys are in school as students that are in PA, and their internship follows when they're in school, whereas you do it concurrently with your schooling. That's not what the terminology means. what the terminology of current intern means. Oh. Current, 2 minutes. Yeah, I was right. All right. Hold on, I'm going to share to get back to this. I said the concurrent internship. You remember it is, okay, so 1 to 3 years. Now, there's that 60 credit requirement. So if you get out of school at a high school, or what, you've just never done any schooling and whatever, you then start off, you want to get a fuel industry or whatever, you would have 2 periods of time. You've got the 1 to 60 credits. Right. And then funeral service ed. Ah, darn it. Hold on. I'll work with the visual unless I spin this out. All right, so the concurrent period is that 1 to 60 credits. This is the concurrent period because you're in school, you're doing your first 60 credits, but you are doing your internship. So you're getting your 75, 75, and 25 in. Now, the funeral service education, again, you're doing it at the same time or concurrently as the internship, but it's not considered the same thing. The quote unquote concurrent internship is during that first 60 credits, right? During that time, you have to send transcripts in to the state board at the end of each semester. And you have to take at least 8 credits per semester. So yeah, but that's just during that concurrent period. At the end of the concurrent period, that's when you get the MQC or AQC issued, right? The mortuary qualifying certificate or academic qualifying certificate. Once you have that done, then you don't need to send transcripts every semester. It just get a little wonky with the wording on that. So new for 2019, preceptors and interns. Preceptors cannot be convicted of a crime in the last 5 years. This has to be a crime related to funeral service. So if you rip off the pre-need funds and you get popped for it or whatever, they're not going to let you do that for 5 years. They'll probably strip you of your license, and correctly so. But or a crime of moral turpitude. Remember, a crime of moral turpitude is like rape or murder, things like that. And you cannot have a revocation, suspension, or surrender of a license from any professional board, meaning that, like, I got a haircut like 2 weeks ago. I was talking to the barber, really nice guy, but he's got his license up there. It looks exactly like a funeral director's license. And we were chit-chatting about that. But let's say that a barber then gets into funeral directing, but he does something awful at his barbershop and loses his license. Oh, okay, that falls under this. That's revocation or suspension or surrender of a license from any professional board. Licensees are now required to notify the mortuary board in writing within 30 days upon conviction of any crime or arrest, summons, indictment, admission, pretrial intervention, guilty plea to any violation of law, ordinance, felony, DUI, misdemeanor, or disorderly offense in New Jersey or any other jurisdiction. It used to be you only had to do this at licensing periods. Everybody was looking forward to the addition of the forum in the odd years around February or March, because that's when all of these reports would come in. And it was like, oh, did you hear so-and-so about a DUI? Oh, did you hear about that? And then it was a whole list. It was like 2 pages of it. It was great. And everybody would chit-chat and gossip and whatnot, But now it's whenever it happens. So I don't know, you go to a football game and you get liquored up and you get arrested for disorderly conduct, right? Drunk in public, something along those lines, or you get a DUI or something worse, I don't know. You have to report that immediately to the state board. You can caught shoplifting or something. That never happens to anybody, or the other things, but you have to report that immediately to the state board. You have 30 days to do so, even before you plead guilty. So you get arrested, you haven't even been to trial yet, but you need to report it to the state board, even if you're completely innocent. Speeding tickets are not included in that. When you're driving 80 and a 65, you get tickets, they don't care about that. Okay, new for 2019, state board clarifying intern responsibilities. Participating in funeral arrangements, preservation, washing, or disposal of dead human bodies, making funeral arrangements on behalf of any licensed practitioner of mortuary science, meaning not just your preceptor. Another licensee is there and your preceptor's off for the weekend, you're allowed to make the arrangements, again, on their behalf. Quoting prices when funeral arrangements are being made. And again, that's, and Shiga, this is sort of what you were asking here. Quoting prices when funeral arrangements are being made, when you're actually sitting at the table and you're making the arrangement directly versus just, quoting a price over the phone. Preceptor is responsible for reviewing and executing the statement of innovative services selected with the intern before providing to the consumer for review. So you finish everything up, the preceptor's up in the office, have a cup of coffee or whatever, you take it up, they look it over, they go, okay, everything is fine. You may now take this down to the family and I'll sign off on it. Interns and advertisements. If an intern in an ad or website, and again, they broaden this to be website or social media. So if the funeral home has a social media account, the website, it has all the same restrictions that a regular ad would have. Two listed as your name, intern registration, and then your intern number. So forms of ownership, your different types, your corporate, and again, the use of manager name, title, sign, etc. Remember, you can be manager, you can be executive director, you can be senior director, but you have to pick one and stick with it. The manager or executive director or senior director, their name has to either be on the sign or it has to be at the entrance to the funeral home. It doesn't have to be both. It can be both, but it doesn't have to be both. The sign has to be visible from the road. Like we get around it with Mercer because the name of the funeral home is Mercer County Community College, and there's a big sign there. My name is not there as manager. It's actually, I don't have it up there. I really should put just a manager thing by the front door, or inside the front door. But again, that's how we get around it. It's you need to be able to see that from the road, but you don't have to have the manager name at both. The death of an owner, how long do you have to then name a new manager, somebody running the show? And again, I'm not giving you this one. I want you guys to look it up. New installation being you build a funeral home. I put Smith Funeral Home, I'm opening this place up and we're going to do business in this town. Same thing as Smith Funeral Home has been in this town for 150 years, but they're moving a block down the street. They bought a different building, they're moving a block down the street. That's a new installation. You still need everything that a new business needs. You need an inspection, you need an approval by the state board. If you come in and you purchase a funeral home, that's a new installation. You purchase Smith Funeral Home, it's not moving anywhere, but you're a new owner. Well, what's involved then? And again, you need to do inspection, you need to do everything else involved with it. But now you need to notify everybody in pre-need. If you close a funeral home, what's required? And we're going to get to that in a bit. Things like covering the sign, making sure that the phones are turned off, things along those lines, and things are pre-need, but we'll talk about that just a little bit. And actually take a look at that, because with the pre-need, if you close it, no, I take that back. There is a new slide that we're going to talk about. An unlicensed owner, you're absolutely allowed to have an unlicensed owner. Like I always say, when it's a kid, my dad died, my mom ran the place. Well, she didn't run it, but she owned it. We had somebody else running it. And she was in school for 3 years. She got licensed, and then she was a licensed owner. But you're certainly allowed to own a funeral home if you're not licensed. You just need somebody to run it for you. Now, pre-need, you need to be licensed to sell pre-need. Signatures on forms. So look at the forms that are required by them. The idea that you need to disclose where these funds are going. You need to disclose, essentially, you need a signature from a person, if it's going into a trust, you need a signature from the person who is going to be paying the taxes on that, because that is a taxable asset. And in most cases, let's say somebody's going through spend down or whatever, you would have that person or their POA, their power of attorney, come in and sign off on that, because they're the people that will be getting that tax. They'll get a yearly statement from choices of whoever you use. But you need to have their signature to do that, because it is, you're dealing with a taxable asset. You need to have a funeral director's signature on it. Trust accounts, and we'll get into the specifics on that in a bit. Change in funeral home. How long do you have? A family comes in, they go, we don't like you anymore. We only use Brand X across the street. How long do you have to switch that over? A pre-need ledger. What's required in the pre-need ledger? And again, this is just something that you receive from whatever funding vehicle you're using, but you need to know what's required in it. And it's things like the date that the funds went in, the amount, the initial amount, the amount of interest that's accrued and whatnot. Who was in charge of this, who actually, is responsible for it, meaning who cut the check for it and whose funeral is this for. The idea that you need a pre-need ledger every month, you need an updated pre-need ledger. And this can be digital now, and we'll talk about that in a bit too, because this is another 2019 change. Cancellation fee, not allowed. You can spend 6 hours making pre-arrangements. They put the money down. A month later, they go, we don't want to use you anymore. We want it to go to your competitor. Your stock, you can't charge them anything. It's kind of a lousy thing, but I see why they did it. And remember, it's 100% pre-need. You can't, or 100% pre-need trusting, in that you can't keep 10% for yourself. It all has to go into the trust, and all has to go back to the family if they change their mind or they want to cancel it out or whatever, unless it is irrevocable. The trust issues 200 accounts. So remember, you have that master trust and it gets 200 accounts. Now they can take 1% of the interest to fund themselves, meaning that if you get to that large of a group, you need somebody there to monitor it. You need to pay somebody to watch over this thing and send the forms out and to fund everything else that trust needs to do. Commissions are only allowed on newly issued insurance, meaning you are an insurance agent. Family comes in, you're going to sell them insurance because it works better. They go, look, mom did worry, she's going through a spend down process. Here's 10 grand. You go, okay, we'll put it into an insurance policy versus the trust. Perfectly fine, perfectly legal. You're allowed to take a commission on that, so long as you disclose that to the family. Meaning that it's just in the paperwork. Like, I take a commission on this, and nobody cares. You don't have to tell them what the commission is that you're taking. Many times that works out better than the trust would. Now, if somebody comes in and they have dad's insurance policy, either paid off or close to being paid off, they're going for spend down, you're not allowed. If you take that and you convert that, maybe they cash it out and they go into the trust, or you make the state the beneficiary and the funeral home the absolute assignee, you're not allowed to take a commission on that. That's not an insurance policy you wrote. So you're not allowed to take a commission on it. It's not something that a commission would naturally come to you anyway. You have to be working for an insurance company for them to give you a commission. POD accounts, payment on death. You're perfectly allowed to do this. I've had students tell me they do this, that they go, yeah, we just send them down to a local bank and they take a funeral bill with them. They say, all right, well, let's put the money in here. When the death happens, we show up with the death certificate, we hand it off to them, and they're good to go. So, new in 2019, in New Jersey, you must notify social services when any refund on irrevocable prepaid funeral, meaning that you have a prepaid funeral, it's irrevocable, the person is on Medicaid, the state's paying for the medical costs, they may be in a nursing home or something, and the money any money that is left over, you have to report back to the state. It used to be a $500 minimum, meaning that $30 is left over after everything was said and done from what they initially put into the trust, whatever. No, give it back to the time, kind of a check for $30. Now, if there's 30 cents left over, you have to report it back to the state. Advertising. You have to use your name as registered. your Smith Funeral Home, but you really would be Smith Memorial Home. No, you can't do that. You need to change your name with the state before you're allowed to do that. And then you have to name the manager. If there's novelty items, so very small. And I just use the example of my Uncle Paul. He used to use golf tees, but they're so small that it's not like a business card. So there was only 2 lines on it. The name of the funeral home. It's a Bud Funeral Home, Woodbury, New Jersey. We used to take handfuls and throw them out of the tee box or whatever you call wherever you tee off. I don't golf. I don't know. I was a member of a country club for like 5 years. I have never golfed. Logo and obit. We'll talk about that in a minute. Testimonials. You can only have a testimonial if the person has actually used your funeral home. They actually have to have used your services. And at the time when I first taught this, it was 2014, early 2014. I made the example of Nick Foles, who was in the news at the time. He was at the time the Eagles starter. And I had a student in the class. I'm very, very friendly with him until today. And he was a big Patriots fan. He was like, oh, Nick Foles is nothing, blah, 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 blah. And then in 2018 when the Eagles when Nick Foles beat Tom Brady in the quarter, I could not wait to get on Facebook and bash this guy as hard as I could. But yeah, you can't have somebody saying, yes, Brand X Funeral Home is great unless they've used the funeral home. Price reductions. You cannot have a price reduction unless that price was the same or higher, I always have things on throw, the same or lower 30 days before. And here's the idea behind this one. This is so involved. I don't know who would think all of this out, but somebody did. So here's the idea. You've got a $300 casket. You then take that casket, you mark it up to $600. You then run an ad saying, you make pre-arrangements, or if you use our funeral home, we will give you this casket at 50% off. That's not really 50% off. All you did is you took a $300 casket, you made it $600. And you go, look, I'm such a nice guy, I took 50% off. No, that doesn't. It's just switching numbers around. Now, if you chose to do this, and I've never seen any funeral home that actually would act in this manner, so I don't know why they bring it up. You have to wait 30 days. So you up it to $600. I'm not saying to do this. You up it to $600. You wait 30 days, then you run an ad going, hey, come on in, we'll sell you this casket half off, 50% off. All right, so here's the ad in the obituary. This was more big in South Jersey than it was in North Jersey. This was really big in the Courier Post. And again, I'm not picking on the Chinuskis. They're very nice people. I was searching for this when I was putting them together for Wells Rules and Regs. I just went to Courier Post, and that was the first one I saw. Funeral homes back in the early O's began running obits, and they would have these long, like, images in them. I remember one that was like a lighthouse, and it was like, we're your bridge over troubled water and all this stuff. The state said, look, you can't make families pay for that. They're not paying for that. That's expensive. You're getting charged by letter of line, you know? So, you know, if you're going to do that, you need to pay for that yourself. And you need to, this falls under the same thing, the same category as any other advertisement. So if this funeral home sent in an obit, they would get 2 bills back, one for the family and one that just has their ad in there. It might be like $50 for that, but maybe $200 for the family. But they also have to name the manager and put everything else in that's required in an advertisement. If you just put in the name of the funeral, Smith Funeral Home, friends and relatives are invited to join the family at Smith Funeral Home, 7 to 9 on Tuesday evening, 435 Main Street, that's fine. Even if you put in arrangements under the care of Smith Funeral Home, whatever, that's perfectly fine to do so. It's just you can't, when you get into the images, that's when it's a problem. Not a problem, but that's when you have to abide by all of the advertisement laws. Again, remember, advertisements include aerial displays, circulars, handbills, flyers, letters, any other similar item, document, publication, or device used to communicate to the general public or to a specific group. New in 2019, all advertising rights extend to funeral home website and social media. So if you have a Twitter page or Facebook or Instagram or whatever, you have to put all of that stuff in. Remember, fines in New Jersey on your first offense, it's not that it's going to be $10,000, but the most they can charge you, you really screw something up, they can charge you up to $10,000 on a fine. Second and subsequent, up to $20,000. And it has happened.
What kind of offense are you talking about?
This normally comes down to things like, and I can think of a funeral home that I know of that they actually sort of financially benefited from this. They had unlicensed people working for years, where they had them making arrangements, doing services, doing embalmings, and everything else. So if you figure how much money they saved over the course of 5 years, let's say they had 3 or 4 people that were unlicensed versus what they would pay a licensee, and they got popped 10,000, that's a win for them financially. But it's things like that. You screw around with pre-need, yeah, they're definitely going to come after you real hard on that. After the Russ Shepard debacle of the early 90s, yeah, they didn't mess around with pre-need after that. The Russ, and I knew Russ, I used to make removals for Russ when I was like a teenager. I liked Russ, but he had gambling and alcohol problems, and he drained his pre-need funds, and it was millions of dollars, and they absolutely popped him with $10,000 for the state board. But then the state's attorney general came after him. You know, I think they sent him to prison for a couple of years. But it tends to be things like that. Now, if the state board inspector shows up and the name on the letters on the manager's name at the front door are not 1.5 inches or 1.25 inch, rather, they're going to pop you $100 until you change the sign. It's things like that. This is the most egregious of violations. So interment, remember the death of burial, and this is if somebody is not in a vault, and again, look this up. Go back to the notes. With somebody, you just put a casket into the ground, and there's not a vault there. It's 4 feet at the top. They have to be at least 4 feet down. And I always remember this, if you think of a casket being roughly 2 feet high, and I'm ballparking it here, that would be 6 feet under, right? You think about 2 feet, somewhere in that range. So you think the bottom of the casket would be about 6 feet down. If it's less than, I'm going on memory here, 4.5 feet long, double check these numbers, please. Then it becomes 3 feet 6 inches. So if you bury a child and it's, again, the shorter casket, then it's less than, it's 3 feet, I believe 3 feet 6 inches, but double check those, please. The concept of temporary burial, the idea that you're waiting for a mausoleum to be built. So you check off, temporary burial on the permit. It has to be checked off on the permit. Then you have up to 4 years, and you don't even need a funeral director there. You can just disinter somebody and move them from one part of the cemetery to the other. It has to be within the same cemetery, but you don't have to file for a disinterment permit. Multiple burials. Remember, more than one person can be buried in a casket. You need the permission from either the decedent, and then it goes just down the normal chain of spouse, children, adult age children, parents, siblings, etc. But they leave the decedent in there with the idea of the terrible idea of a woman giving birth and she's dying and the child has died, and she's I want to be buried with the child. They go, all right, well, in that particular case, she can get permission to do so. Disinterment, your idea of multi-death burials, which are absolutely allowed, but also bear in mind, if you're doing a disinterment, you need to have the permission of everybody above the person you are disinterring. sorry, there it is. So you've got a grave. You've got casket number 2, casket number 1, and you want to disinter this person here. You need all of the signatures and the permissions from this person right here, because you are disrupting their eternal rest. They have to be removed from the ground for you to then take that casket number 1 out and then put casket number 2 down. So we need agreements from everybody involved on that. And again, remember with disinterment, you need the consent of the spouse and all adult children. The adult children have as much say as the spouse after a person has been interred, which I think is a weird regulation. I think it's very, very odd. I don't know why New Jersey writes it this way. I've never seen any other state that does this, but the kids have as much say as the spouse once the person has actually been interred. So cremation, remember, the crematory has to be owned by a cemetery. This goes back to, I think, a 1972 law, and there's 3 funeral homes that were grandfathered in. If you go to a crematory, you need a presence of a licensee. Remember the record keeping, and all of this is laid out in the laws, rules, and rights class. Things like they need to know the date of death, place of death, the next of kin, the funeral home information, the info for disposition of cremated remains, meaning did they hand them off to the funeral home? Did they hand them off to a family? Did they, on behalf of the family, scatter them at sea? Unclaimed cremated remains. Remember, you have to wait at least a year before you can dispose of them, and you have to do due diligence in contacting the family. Maybe sending a certified letter. That's really what they recommend, sending 2 certified letters, and then you have to dispose of them in a respectful manner. You can't just take them and chuck them in the trash. All right, statement of funeral goods and services selected. New for 2019. Statement at the top. And again, this is really getting into minutiae here. This statement is subject to change by agreement of both parties, meaning that you screw something up instead of writing the whole thing out. If you make a little change, if both people initial it, that's fine. The checkboxes for sex have been removed and they've left it open-ended. Sex and gender and all that stuff got a little more complicated over the last 5 or 10 years. And so if somebody's non-binary or whatever, it's you could write that in there. Sanitary care within embalming has been changed to other prep of the body. Use of facilities and staff for viewing and visitation has been switched. It's been switched to use of facilities and staff for viewing and visitation rather than just viewing. Added to use of equipment and staff for graveside, the line, including accompaniment of remains to place of final disposition. I doubt you're going to see questions about this, but I just want to include it because it's all new and I don't know what they're going to be putting on there. Statement of funeral goods and services selected continued receiving and forwarding of remains on different lines. Used to just be one. I need to put a charge in, and they sort of looked at it and said maybe you have different charges for them. Optional package service selection. If an optional package service is selected, categories 1 through 3 are not applicable, meaning first being basic services, funeral director and staff, transportation, other services of funeral director and staff, things like that. Have now been, they basically say you could ignore all of that and just look to this package. Now, the first thing that people ask is, okay, are you allowed to have a memorial service if you have a direct cremation? And this was asked to the state, and they said no. The idea of a direct cremation is solely a direct cremation where you're not doing any services. If you're doing a memorial service, and regardless of what you do in practice, because I know I've skipped over this before, especially if I had families that were, a little having a hard time financially. What you're supposed to do is put in the basic services, funeral director and staff, removal, transportation to the crematory, sheltering of remains, whatever you do, and then a memorial service charge on top of that. Nobody ever said you can't discount everything down. You put in all of those charges that you normally would. Doesn't mean you can't just go manager's discount of $800 or something, that's perfectly fine to do. But you have to spell everything out on the statement of funeral goods and services. If somebody just wants a direct cremation, that's all they're doing, they're putting an obit in or something, that's all cash advances, that's fine. But you have to just, if you are doing any services, you have to spell all of those charges out on the statement of funeral goods and services. Other wording changes, clergy and church now officiant, place of worship, newspaper notice to obituary charge, the line for pallbearers has been removed, but you can write it in. Price reduction removed, but it can be written in because what they have is the total and then grand total with a space between it. So if somebody is doing a package deal and it's saving them $600, so you can write price reduction in between the two, $600, and then just discount it down. So miscellaneous, where to file the death certificate. Remember, there's three places: municipality of death, municipality of funeral home, municipality of disposition. You can get death certificates from all those three places plus the state. The cost of permit is $5. Renting a funeral home to another person. Remember, only a manager or owner can do this. Now, if you're working on behalf of a funeral home and doing it, it's fine, but the manager is the person that's going to have to sign off and everything, because you can't just be. There was a guy, I remember we bought a funeral home. He was a little ticked that we bought it. He went, and he, by the way, this is a close friend of mine now. He's gotten us so many donors over the years. I wanted to strangle him at one point. Now we're really good friends, but he began running ads saying, "Wow, don't bother, calling that funeral home. Just switch your funeral arrangements over to me. Here's my cell phone number." That's illegal. You're not allowed to do that. Like you have to represent a funeral home, and if they call him and he's then calling a friend of his going, "Wow, I need to go here. I'll embalm the body." It doesn't work that way. You have to have the paperwork from a funeral home. You need to sit down with you from Smith Funeral Home and fill out the statement of funeral goods and services, their general price list, everything else, and then end up, renting Brand X Funeral Home. But it can't just be Joe Blow, funeral director, doing this. A receiving vault. Okay, this is such a rare thing. I have never seen this in my career. When I asked Rob Smith about this, he was like, "I saw one once. I was newly licensed. It was like 1972. This would be an area where if it's too cold to dig in the ground, they would keep the body in a receiving vault at a cemetery. In New Jersey, they had to be at least 5 feet underground or designed in a way to prevent the escape of noxious fumes or odors. Something you just don't see. But who knows if it'll ever pop up. Otherwise, they're not built that way, and it's just a garage where they keep the body. If it is an unembalmed body, they can only store it there for 48 hours after death. Something you'll never see in your career. This is an odd one. Clear, white, or flesh-colored adhesive tape has to be kept at the funeral home. Somebody saw duct tape on a decedent, like on plastics underneath their clothing, and complained to the state board and the state's response. And then the response was like, "Well, what the hell do you call flesh-colored? What is that?" And I'm like, each community can decide for themselves what that is. That's such a dumb thing. But every funeral home has to have clear, white, or quote unquote flesh-colored adhesive tape in the prep room. All right, welfare versus Medicaid. Remember, it's actually welfare. It's not Medicaid. We call it Medicaid, and you tend to deal with the adult Medicaid office, but it's not Medicaid. It's welfare. The amounts for the 3 different groups: an adult, a child up to 2 years old, and a child from birth to 6 days. What are those different amounts? The form to use, and it's it comes up both ways. The PA 11, which everybody thought was Pennsylvania, it's not. It's Public Assistance 11, versus what is now WFNJ-11, which is Work First New Jersey 11. Students have told me they've seen it both ways on the test, so I don't know how you'll see that. And where's the claim submitted? It's submitted at a county level. Like whenever I deal with Camden County, it's a bit of a nightmare, whereas Burlington County is relatively easy. Yes, no, and that's a really good question. Again, you're on fire time with the questions. I hadn't thought about this. They are tinkering with it, and they are making the changes to it. I would know both to be safe. Anything going on in the test, actually, now that I think about it, chances are they will probably stray away from that for the next year or a year and a half because of that change. I forgot that they changed that. Yeah, I still know the 2275. And Shigo, do you know what the updated amount is? I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. But yeah, I would look over it. But my guess would be they'll stray away from it this year. Look them over, they'll double check them, just because they tend to give it time for that information to matriculate through the funeral industry and work its way into the different curriculums. Yeah, it's a really good question. So emergency burial permit, this is probably something I should probably take this off here. It used to be, let's say you had a long weekend and everything was shut down. You had family come in, they needed a burial done in 48 hours, maybe for religious reasons. You could go before a justice of the peace and they would issue you a burial permit. Today, it's really not the case because of EDRS. And it's really blurred the lines of what that is, where it used to be you would fill out the paperwork and take it to the state agency, they would look it over, they would then say, yes, everything's fine, then give you a burial permit. EDRS has really blurred the lines of this. Now, no person in charge of the cemetery, if that's the case, the funeral director is in charge of actually filing the paperwork, the burial permit. All right, so I'll come back to that communicable disease list of reporting. You're supposed to report within 12 hours of communicable diseases. I have a slide on that later on. Now, reporting veterans' death, if you remember from laws, rules, and regulations, it's something you're never going to see. The scenario is this. Somebody has died outside of New Jersey. Let's say they've died in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, let's say. They're a veteran. You were then going to a cemetery that does not have anybody in charge. Anybody who lives in a small town or something is familiar with one of these small cemeteries that hasn't been a burial in it since 1968, and there's really nobody there running the day-to-day operations. It's just an old, small municipal cemetery. Now, if you bury the person there, and again, there's nobody in charge of it, it then falls to the funeral director to notify the head of the Veterans Affairs in that county that a veteran has been buried there. And the idea is this: if they had died within the state and you filled out EDRS, they would have been notified that a veteran was buried there. If somebody was running the cemetery would notify them that a veteran was buried there. But because neither of these two things happened, they died outside of the state and you're not dealing with EDRS, you then need to notify them. So on Veterans Day and Memorial Day, Flag Day and everything else, they can come out and maybe put a flag there on the marker and something to acknowledge that. Again, a scenario you will most likely never see, but something that they could very well test you on which they could test, I suppose, with the proper English. So EDRS, you guys know what EDRS is. There's nothing there. Burial at sea. If you look at the information from Principles of Funeral Services, a breakdown of this, what's required, and I forget this, the amount, and I would have known this when I took the test, and I haven't taught that class ever, and I haven't taken the class in 20 years. The amount of ballast you need to put in, the amount of holes you need to drill into the casket, how far out to sea do you need to go, who do you need to notify? All of that is in both the book for principles as well as the supplement. It gives a breakdown of all of that. The amount of straps that you need to put around the casket, signatures on the death certificate, and for disinterment, who needs to sign these things? Remember the death certificates, the funeral director, the pronouncer, the certifier, and the registrar. And the certifier and the pronouncer can be the same person. Disinterment, there's 7. I doubt they're going to ask all 7 of these. This is something my predecessor was so big into. And this actually goes back to both field experience and laws, rules, and regs. I wouldn't beat yourself up on that too much. There's 7 copies of that form. And, again, it just creates accountability. Who needs to sign the statement of goods and services selected? The FTC disclosure disclaimer, you don't need one. you don't have to prove that everybody received a GPL. You're supposed to give one to everyone, but you don't need to have them sign a form. I think it's a good idea and it's a good CYA, but it's not something that is necessarily required. You know, if a family shows up at the FTC and they go, I wasn't given a GPL, that's one thing. But if the FTC shows up at your door and goes, how do we know that you gave out a general price list to every family that came through? You say, I just gave them one. The burden of proof is on you to say, I didn't give one out.
Well, there's that FTC form, right? That we have them sign, that we gave them the GPL.
It's a good idea to have, but that's not from the FTC. That would be something that the funeral home would write.
Okay, that's from the funeral home.
I'm sorry?
And that's from the funeral home. That's not required by the state.
Exactly, 100%.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's a really good distinction to make because most funeral homes have these. It's a good idea to just go, yeah, look, everybody knows we're doing the right thing over here, but it's not required by the government. Uniform Anatomical Gift Act, when somebody gives remains to a donor program, the donor program does not have to give them back. They are not giving them, it's not the same thing as a funeral home. You're bequeathing the remains to them. If somebody called up to the donor program at Mercer and said, I want the remains back, I could say, go pound sand. I wouldn't, I would never do that. But the idea comes from, you know, we just got, I don't know if you guys saw or not, that table that Aldo Juice got. It was like 83 grand or something like that. And what this has is 5 or 6 bodies in it that are not physically in it, but digital copies of them, where they just shaved down like a millimeter, right? Starting the nose and doing the whole body, and they recreated them digitally. So you can get into any section of the body, any organ, any system. It's wild stuff. It's really, really neat. But she was, I'm sorry, but let's say before she ordered it, they spent 6 months shaving this body down, getting it apart. And the halfway through that, a family calls up and goes, I want mom back. Well, you can't. She's in like slides and stuff. It's impossible, you know. Victims of crimes compensation, the amounts for it, they've recently upped this. It used to just be 5,000. I want to say it's 65, maybe 7 grand, but I could be wrong on that. Off the top of my head, I don't remember what they are. Medical waste, what is medical waste, what is not medical waste. And then wills terminology. I don't think you see a lot on that, but it's not a bad idea to understand the basic concepts of probate, you know, your executor, your executrix, your administrator, your administratrix, tricks, you know, the basics on that. I think we'll see more of that on the national than we will on the state exam. All right, so prohibited embalming compounds. These are things to know. And again, we don't make embalming fluids. So I don't know why they have this in there. Arsenic, lead, mercury, zinc, silver, antimony, chloral, any poisonous alkaloid, substances include copper and cyanogen. And the communicable diseases, which you have 12 hours to notify the health department if you have a body with any of these. I think if you notified the health department, like, what the hell are we supposed to do? Smallpox, cholera, yellow fever, typhus fever, and plague. And that is that. So good. Questions about it? No, I knew a whole lot at you guys. Participants. All right. Fantastic. And what I'm going to be doing is, like I said, I'm going to be downloading this and putting it on to the YouTube page. So please feel free to download it. I'll put the other links up there as well with the how many questions of the exam. They have not told me this. When I took it, it was 50. I believe it is still 50, but Cindy at the state board, with whom I have a wonderful relationship, but she's not really allowed to give out a lot of information on it. And so, yeah, Grace, you heard it's 50 as well. Students have told me it's 50, but they never tell me when they're going to change it. So I don't want to give you a solid number on that. And even the folks at the testing center, like Sarah Collins, who's really, really nice, Susan Collins, rather, I should remember her name, Amy Collins, 3 times as a charm. I haven't seen these people in 2.5 years, keep that in mind, but they have the damn test. And I'm like, wouldn't you just tell me something about it? Like, oh, we can't tell you anything about it. So yeah, it's normally 50 questions. They didn't tell me when they went from, it was all, you used to all be true and false, and then they switched it up and made it multiple choice. Because I thought the true and false was the hardest ever, because they would write the questions in a way, like when I took it with the chemicals you're not allowed to use in embalming fluid, they had 6 that were correct and 1 that was incorrect. And true or false, these are not allowed to be used in embalming fluid. Well, 6 were not, but the 7th was allowed to be used, and so the answer was false. And it's like, what the hell? It's not a reading comprehension test, but that's the way that they were writing the questions at the time. It's that they switched that a few years ago. So it should, I'm not gonna say it's straightforward, but I think if you review everything from this, I think if you review laws, rules, and regulations, and I think if you go through the statutes and the regs, I think you guys should be all right. But again, reach out to me if you've taken it. Let me know how you feel about it. And I will, as soon as you have access to the winter class videos. I don't think so. But any ones that you want, if you reach out to me, I can get you copies of them. I never delete them, you know. So they're always kicking around. I always just leave them as locked down because I don't want just anybody watching them. But if you want copies of them, reach out to me and I can most likely find them for you. But yeah, let me know how you make out on it, and all the best, guys. I wish you all the best.
I have one quick question, because I noticed on the national board, they said we needed masks for testing. Does that still hold true for Mercer College?
Mercer has not been requiring masks. It's not a bad idea to toss one in your pocket just in case, but we haven't required masks in a couple of months. So it's I don't think so. But again, the testing center might be doing something different. It's not a bad idea to just have one in your pocket just in case, but I don't think you'll need one.
Okay, thank you. That was a great review.
Hey, sure thing. Good. I hope, again, I hope you guys all did great on it. And questions about any of the stuff, reach out to me, and I'm happy to elaborate wherever I can. And again, best of luck in all of that and the rest of the licensing requirements. You're very welcome. Any other questions? 1, 3, 2, 1. All right, fantastic, guys. Have a good evening. And like I said, I'll look to hear from you guys if you take the test.